There's a point where there are significant diminishing returns if I don't get any recovery in.
Absolutely.
And I'm just trying to eke out more productivity to the point where it's almost a joke to continue to work.
Yeah.
Like
obviously,
I'll work
it's irresponsible.
I'm working worse and worse at increasingly pointless things.
And then what starts to happen is you start to actually do negative work and gain negative leverage and actually dig a hole. Welcome to the Seek and Flow podcast, where we synthesize the most important research on flow state and consciousness development into protocols that help you reach your potential. If you're new here, I'm Rian Doris, and I now lead flowstate.com with my writing partner here, Joshua Voiles, who's a writer, artist, and performance expert. And today we got an exciting core foundational peak performance topic, which is recovery. There's a really nice breakdown from a great Harvard Business Review article, Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz, called The Corporate Athlete, the peak performing entrepreneur ideally aspires to, which is to be an entrepreneurial athlete.
Blew my mind when I read it.
The key point that they make is that the average professional athlete, I'm thinking of my younger brother here, for example, is a professional rugby player, captain of Ireland, shout out to Caelan.
Yeah.
The average professional athlete spends the majority of their time training.
Yes.
And only a very small percentage of their time competing. The typical entrepreneur is very much so inverted.
Yeah.
When it comes to that. They spend very, very small percentages of their total time doing their equivalent to training.
Just to be clear though, the athlete, what is training? What does training mean versus the game?
Training means engaging in activities that expand the athlete's capacity to perform at an optimal level in the game, in competition time.
Okay.
For the entrepreneur, training means capacity expanding activities, which in this case specifically refers to recovery.
Entrepreneurs spend very little time.
Entrepreneurs do the equivalent of competing all day.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yeah.
Which is working 10, 12, 16, 18 hours a day, whatever it is, and tend to spend very, very little time in intentional recovery. It ends up massively decreasing performance and output and productivity. The key misunderstanding that leads to entrepreneurs under-indexing on recovery is not realizing that energy is the lever point or a critical lever point for peak performance.
Yeah, it's not the hours, it's the energy in the hours.
Exactly.
That determines your output. Did you ever experience this directly, where you hit a ceiling on your productivity and your output as a consequence of not recovering sufficiently?
I remember when I was about 22 being in this, it was pre-Oura Ring days. My general work pattern was sleep as little as I could to function at a basic level.
That's right.
And then maximize work hours across every waking moment outside of that.
That's right.
And I remembered hearing stories about Navy SEALs who, when on duty, would sleep, 3-4 hours a night. And then in every moment throughout the day where they were static, they would instantly fall asleep. And I assumed that if I was doing the same thing, it was great.
Yeah.
Being like a Navy SEAL. So I would literally have things happen, like getting an Uber to the office in the morning after having gotten up, and I'd instantly pass out because I was so fatigued from sleeping 3, 4, 5 hours. Or at lunch, after I'd finished lunch, I'd sit on the couch in the office and I'd instantly pass out for 5 or 10 minutes. The fatigue was so high that I would fall asleep within 60 to 90 seconds of not being engaged in an activity.
That's incredible.
Incredible in a bad way. I think the biggest problem was that I took pride in that.
Right. Yeah, you saw that.
I thought it was optimal.
There was a time when I was working full time, and I would wake up early in the morning to work on a book I was writing. And I would get in a good hour before I had to go to work. And I would always do 7 hours of sleep. And it was always such a slog. And I worked on it and I got it done eventually, but it was just this tons of work. Everything was harder. It just took longer, but I kept doing it. For some reason or another, I decided to get 8 hours of sleep. I think it was an accident. One night I just didn't set the alarm or something. And I woke up, 8 hours of sleep, sat down, I get to do the writing, blaze through it. Like it just felt, everything was clear. It was all there, it didn't feel like work. It was a joy to do, I said, well, God darn, I think I'll try doing that again. And next night I slept 8 hours, got up, so much easier, way more progress, way faster, way more enjoyable. Everything about it was better. Went to work energized because I, bagged an hour on the book. And from then on out, I was like, geez, I'm just going to do 8 hours of sleep. For me, it was like the difference between that 1 hour was night and day. Yeah. And it kind of blew my mind.
More recovery is effective purely because it gives you more output. Jim and Tony, they use a term that I really like to describe this whole dynamic. And it's oscillation. They refer to oscillation as this process of rhythmically moving between two states. There's exertion, work, stress, which all fall into the same bucket on one side of the coin. And then there is recovery, renewal, regeneration that all fall into the same bucket on the other side of the coin. And you ideally perform at a 10 out of 10 level on both sides of the peak performance coin. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, you end up falling into the sort of traps that we're talking about. Simple analogy for this, just to land it, is with weight training. There's a fundamentally similar dynamic where you go to the gym, you lift weights. That's the stress or exertion side of the coin. You break down the muscle fibers, and then you take a day off or take time off, and the muscles renew. Same thing in terms of how your overall nervous system works. You exert it, and then you replenish it. And when you replenish it through recovery, your capacity for future exertion isn't just renewed, it's expanded.
Yeah, your biceps bigger.
In weight training, it's called supercompensation. And it's the same kind of thing we want to do ideally as entrepreneurs, is we want to exert, recover, and then bam, have the supercompensation effect kick in so that we actually have more capacity to exert later. Now, if you don't oscillate and you do the equivalent of just lifting weights endlessly, all day, every day. Dorian Yates, the OG bodybuilder, used to talk a lot about this. He was famous for doing only 4 40-minute workouts a week at an extremely high intensity level. And if anyone's seen the old school pictures of Dorian Yates, that guy looked like he looked like one of those cows that are given high dose steroids. You ever seen those pictures?
God.
You ever seen those?
No, I've never seen.
Oh my goodness! Like shocking looking beasts.
Yeah.
He looked just absolutely insane. When he walked out on the Mr. Olympia stage, I think it was 1992, was when he competed. People were in shock. They'd never seen a physique like that.
Yeah.
The leanness and the size, and people used to talk about the graininess of the muscle. But his whole philosophy was very aligned to what we're talking about here. Extremely high intensity bursts with a minimal, viable, effective dose of exertion, and then a tremendous amount of discipline and intentionality applied to recovery. He was controversial with his training methodology because it went against what the 60s classic bodybuilders, they would do 6 to 8 hours of training a day often. All day, and they would do that, 5-6 days a week. I think even more than that sometimes. And Dorian's point was that it was just very ineffective after a certain threshold.
And you just end up risking damage.
You end up risking damage.
Point. Yeah.
And you end up just plateauing. You can make the same argument for entrepreneurs, which is, after the first 8 hours of extremely high quality, high leverage, goal directed work is done, is the extra 4 or 6 hours across a macro time scale actually increasing output and accelerating progression? Very often, no, is the answer.
Recovery determines the ceiling on your performance.
Yeah. People talk about mental masturbation. You can slip into the execution equivalent very, very easily.
Oh, yeah.
Execution, masturbation, doing masturbation. It's a little bit strange. For it's not my favorite term for it. A little bit crass, but it does drive the point home, which is that it's really easy to get off on the fact that you're just doing more and you're pounding more in, and to fall into this very naive, imprecise state where you're identified with your exertion of effort.
There's a point where there are significant diminishing returns. If I don't get any recovery in,
absolutely,
and I'm just trying to eke out more productivity, to the point where it's almost a joke to continue to work.
Yeah.
Like
obviously,
I'll work
irresponsible.
I'm working worse and worse at increasingly pointless things.
And then what starts to happen is you start to actually do negative work and gain negative leverage and actually dig a hole by doing just misdirected, ineffective work.
I feel bad for the people who get caught up in that vortex.
Yeah, you don't want to get caught up in that vortex.
James Cook, our chief science officer, put together a nice synthesis of what's happening in this oscillation on a cellular level. So during periods of exertion, energy depletion, that comes from this grinding we're talking about, activates AMP, activated protein kinase, AMPK, metabolic sensor. In response, recovery phases initiate PCG1A mediated mitochondrial biogenesis. Quite a mouthful. It's increasing the energy generating capacity of the cell, right? So this process, it's known as supercompensation, as you mentioned. It doesn't just restore the baseline function, but it enhances the future performance potential. That's the capacity expansion we're talking about. So rest and recovery in this context is a stimulus for adaptation on a cellular level.
Yeah, right, exactly. So the supercompensation analogy from weightlifting that we're also analogizing across to entrepreneurial work actually mimics a dynamic that occurs on the cellular level. What is your recovery? The first key distinction that I always make for people when they ask that question is a distinction between relaxation and recovery.
Yeah, the rule is don't relax, recover.
Now, and sometimes those two things overlap. Sure. And they're synonymous, but often they're not. The simple example of how they are not synonymous is that jumping in an ice bath is very far from relaxing, at least while you're in it. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in on full high alert, and that thing is, extremely uncomfortable. However, from a recovery standpoint, it's very effective at rejuvenating the nervous system. Yeah. Measured through metrics like heart rate variability, so you can actually quantify the difference that it makes. And on the other hand, doing something that one perceives as relaxing, like watching a Netflix show, watching some true crime or whatever, may feel relaxing while eating a bunch of whatever food, ice cream, something that someone wants to eat after a hard day's work. The subjective experience of that can be very relaxing, but is it actually rejuvenating the nervous system and driving recovery? Not necessarily. Now, sometimes those things overlap. I think a sauna is quite a good example. The sauna is relaxing in terms of the subjective experience, and it does also rejuvenate the nervous system and drive actual recovery. The quantifiable way to know if something counts as recovery, and we'll get into examples of active recovery activities in a moment, is whether it increases heart rate variability or not.
So what I've started thinking of active recovery protocols is something that expands my capacity when I get back to work.
Yeah.
That's actually the main thing that I think of as an active recovery protocol. And objectively, there's things that I do that definitely don't increase my HRV, that they do what I'm talking about. There is the parasympathetic nervous system activity that can come from these active recovery protocols we'll talk about, but there's a psychological recovery process that I think takes place too. Hiking is a perfect example where I'll go and I'll do a marathon hike of some kind up the mountains. That night, I pretty much always have a lower HRV than usual because the exertion physically was so high.
Right.
But because the physical exertion is overall extremely different than the cognitive exertion of my day-to-day professional life, there's something happening there that allows me to go back to the cognitive channel, as it were, and exert higher and better than I did before.
Well, that's a really key point. So a lot of active recovery activities that drive rejuvenation of the nervous system decrease immediate physiological recovery in the very short term, and you get this sort of sympathetic rebound.
So you're spiking with sympathetic activity, you're spiking that fight or flight response intentionally to get a rebound.
To get a parasympathetic rebound, which is part of how recovery occurs.
So I'm interested in the most effective active recovery protocols.
Yeah.
What are they?
The guidance here is to build an active recovery calendar or schedule that involves implementing active recovery activities in your life across various time intervals, from an annual cadence all the way back to an hourly cadence. And
Okay.
I'll start with the annual, and then we can run through the specific activities that you would do across all of these. So at an annual level, ideally, you have some kind of 2-week block of time, maybe a vacation, but ideally in the vacation, you're not just relaxing and you're not just doing passive recovery, you're embedding active recovery in it if your goal is peak performance at least.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be a 2-week vacation where you go, I don't know, you go to Europe and you intentionally drop a bunch of active recoveries into that, viewing that vacation as a critical part of your year's output and ability to output. You're viewing it as a capacity expansion activity, not just something that is geared towards a positive subjective experience of fun, relaxation, and leisure. And so examples of things you might drop in there would be very intentionally doing a 90-minute massage, which is an example of active recovery activity every 2 days, doing breath work every morning, or having a really disciplined morning routine where you do 2 or 3 times the amount of time dedicated to rejuvenating activities that you would do normally in a normal day.
Do you sit down at the beginning of the year? Do you pull up your calendar and say, okay, when's this going to be? And then it's like sacrosanct, that period? Or do you book the tickets in advance so that you can't back out of it? Like I'm just...
Well, so I'll really quickly lay out the total calendar,
okay.
Default calendar.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can play with these blocks as you wish.
Okay.
Is really the key point. And I think you and I both actually don't do annually because of just how we like to run our lives and because of the freedom and autonomy we have. So, the default would be 2 weeks dedicated to active recovery a year, a week, ideally, dedicated to active recovery per quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And
by week, that's like 5 days off, as it were, than the weekend.
Look, if you're doing 2 weeks annual, let's call it a long weekend a quarter, from like a Wednesday to a Sunday, or a Thursday to a Sunday per quarter.
Mm-hmm.
A weekend fully and singularly dedicated to active recovery per month.
Mm-hmm.
A day dedicated to active recovery per week.
Mm.
An hour dedicated to active recovery per day, and 1 to 3 minutes dedicated to active recovery per hour.
Mm.
That's the full scaffold.
Okay.
The kind of base default scaffold that works for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But you can play with it as you wish. Again, what I do, I don't do the annual thing, but every quarter I do a Friday to the following Sunday, which is whatever that is, 9-10 days.
Yeah.
And I do that 4 times a year. And usually what I'll do in there, personally, what I just like to do is a silent meditation retreat.
Okay.
That's what I do personally. Usually, it varies a little bit, but I try and hit that. And then very consistently, I will hit a day per week, pretty much every single week. And then pretty much every single day, I'll hit an hour a day. And then obviously I try and, get the micro recovery in on the hourly basis as well. You can tweak that and toy with it as fits your desires, your family needs, your business needs. But ideally, you're getting roughly that total amount of time in spread across a year.
What are the protocols?
Yeah, that's the frame for the timing.
Yeah.
There's a whole host of protocols. I'll run through them at a very quick clip and just list them out so people can get kind of a general feel for what they are. Breathwork, cold therapy, heat therapy, massage or structural integration, myofascial release, meditation, high intensity interval training or other forms of exercise, hiking, nature immersion, forest bathing, social interaction, sleep. Quick note on sleep is that sleep may seem like passive recovery because it's a activity within which we are physically passive. Mm-hmm. We're not moving, but sleep is a form of active recovery because it accelerates recovery faster than vegging around awake.
Yeah, it is the most important form of recovery.
It's the baseline. It's kind of the core pillar of recovery is sleep. Memories are getting consolidated.
Lymphatic drainage.
Exactly. Lymphatic drainage is occurring. There's a ton that's happening that your physiology is doing, even though you're consciously not doing it while you're asleep. Ideally, in your daily active recovery protocol, you have something that cultivates increased mindfulness, and you have something that increases parasympathetic activation of the nervous system. Those are kind of the 2 key pieces, mind and body. There's a number of different things that increase mindfulness specifically. What I do is I meditate for an hour every morning, which obviously increases mindfulness. But while meditating, I do vagal breathing, which allows for mindfulness to be increased at the same time as parasympathetic activation being increased. Then I do 3 rounds of Buteyko breathwork, which gets a nice nitric oxide flush going and increases parasympathetic activation even more. And then I do about a 10 to 15 minute myofascial release and yoga flow, which also increases interoception, or the degree to which you feel your own sense of connectedness to your body and presence within your body, which people refer to as being grounded as well. So I do those are the 3 pillars on your daily that you're hitting activities that increase mindfulness, parasympathetic activation, and interoception. And they're all going to all do that to some degree.
Sure.
But you want ones that drive each of those 3 pillars up as much as possible on a daily basis.
Okay.
On a weekly basis, I will have a day that's blocked out for active recovery. I'll do a long sauna, cold plunge session, massage, sensory deprivation or float tank, and nature immersion, usually.
So this is stacking active recovery protocols.
It's a stack where you're basically devoting the day to it. If you think about that's the day devoted to it.
Yeah.
More or less.
Yeah.
What I also like to do is layer that in with social interaction, which for a number of different reasons also accelerates recovery. If it's positive social interaction.
Yeah. Hopefully, with any luck.
Yeah, you just do that with a friend, do that with a partner, do that with a spouse, do that with your kids.
Yeah.
Try and stack it and integrate it socially as much as you can. And then a monthly full weekend would involve 2 to 3 days stacked with
protocols.
Activities like those and like the example activities that we've mentioned.
Okay.
They're all geared toward recovery.
So what's going on with active recovery? How does this actually work?
What's happening here?
Yeah, what's happening in the body and the brain?
Yeah. So there is a researcher called Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, and he coined the term allostatic load, which is a technical term that describes the physical wear and tear on your body and your mind from constantly adjusting to life's pressures. So it's basically what happens when the physiology that evolution has evolved for you to help you stab a threatening animal in the head so that you don't die constantly gets used for responding to an alarm that tells you that you got to leave your house to go to work.
Yep.
Or that kicks into gear when you get a call from your boss.
Yep.
As that hardware that was evolved for life or death situations gets applied across non-life or death situations constantly and incessantly through the day, you accumulate allostatic load, which shows up as decreased HRV, chronic stress, burnout, a number of these different maladaptive symptoms, which all overlap but are actually distinct, both in the phenomenology or the experience that they induce, and then also in the physiological signature that they come with. Burnout and chronic stress, for example, are slightly distinct, and allostatic load.
So this is chronic cortisol exposure, which downregulates dopamine D1 receptors, which degrades your working memory, your goal prioritization, and executive oversight, among many other things. So there's a massive breakdown if you don't clear this allostatic load.
It flatlines and tanks your recovery and lands you in the kind of place that we were talking about, where you're a dog chasing your own tail, getting increasingly stressed at doing so and increasingly ineffective at catching your own tail.
Yeah, and you also end up in the dreaded gray zone, where you're sort of in between working and not working.
The worst state.
Incredibly ineffective. It's the antithesis of peak performance.
Yeah, the analogy that I've always liked for that is that you ideally want to live and work like a lion.
Yeah, binary on or off.
A binary on or off fashion, with the gray zone being a state that you
don't know.
Detest.
You detest and you eliminate.
Exactly, and it becomes a distant memory, hopefully, with time. With that gray zone being defined as not fully working, not fully recovering, and just kind of being in this mid territory where you're not quite exerting and you're definitely not recovering. Ideally, instead, you function like a lion and you sprint, you catch your prey, you fully relax and recover until it's time to sprint and catch the prey again. Yeah.
So an interesting finding. James Cook's research synthesized this chronic stress, the type that we're talking about, and basically never clearing the allostatic load, always having that cortisol drip. It disrupts the neurochemical requirements for flow state. So persistently high cortisol suppresses tyrosine hydroxylase, which is the rate-limiting enzyme in dopamine synthesis, and it contributes to dendritic atrophy in the medial prefrontal cortex. This results in lower dopamine tone, impaired goal-directed control, and reduced emotional regulation. So practically speaking, it raises the threshold that's required to enter flow. The challenge skill sweet spot becomes hard to reach.
Decreases flow proneness.
Not because of the external challenge being changed, but the internal neuromodulatory conditions no longer support, that low friction switching and pattern integration.
Puts your baseline state further from flow state.
So you got to clear it.
You got to clear it no matter what. It's like, plaque is going to accumulate on your teeth.
Yeah.
On a daily basis.
If you don't brush your teeth.
Yeah. If you don't, exactly. Regardless of what you do, it's going to build up.
Yeah.
More or less.
Yeah.
It's not a function of eating in a certain way.
Yep.
Necessarily. We've put together a nice tool for everyone, which is an active recovery calendar and a much more detailed breakdown on all the active recovery protocols that you can deploy across that active recovery calendar so that you can quickly build yourself out a really effective schedule for keeping allostatic load clear so that you can stay closer to flow. Click the link. That'll be in the description below. Pop your email in and we'll zip it to you for free right away. And thanks so much for listening and for seeking flow with us.